She bought a house just to earn some extra money. But while removing the old floorboards, she stumbled upon a hatch that no one knew about. Underneath it was a secret room and documents that could destroy the reputation of the entire city. See what her decision not to remain silent led to. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The contract was signed on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of morning when the sky seemed permanently smudged with dust and the air felt stale before noon. Laura Mitchell closed the folder in front of her and looked at the real estate agent across the desk. He smiled in that hurried, distracted way of people who have already moved on to their next transaction. To him, the house she had just bought was another figure on a spreadsheet, another file to be archived once the payment cleared. To Laura, however, it represented both a risk and a lifeline. After months of uneven work, mounting bills, and the dull exhaustion of starting over after her divorce, she needed a property that would flip quickly and cleanly. The small house on the edge of Sanders Hill looked perfect for that, cheap enough to promise profit, simple enough to repair, and isolated enough to avoid neighbors' gossip. She drove out to see it that afternoon. The road that led to the property wound through a stretch of dry pines and empty fields, their grass bleached yellow by summer. When the house finally came into view, it appeared older than it had in the photos. A single-story structure with faded paint, shutters hanging askew, and a porch sagging under its own weight. Still, the frame looked solid, and the lot itself was wide. The agent had been right. The place had good bones. For Laura, that was what mattered. She saw not the decay, but the potential profit hidden beneath it. The air inside smelled of dust and varnish. The floors creaked under her boots, but the walls were steady and the ceilings didn't leak. In the living room stood a fireplace with an iron plate dated 1954, a relic from when such houses were built with care rather than efficiency. She walked through the narrow hallway, checking outlets, measuring the width of door frames, already calculating what materials she would need. It was a familiar rhythm, almost comforting, the quiet math of restoration. When she stepped onto the back porch, she could see the line of hills beyond the property and the faint shimmer of the river further down. The nearest neighbor was an elderly woman named Mary Hanley, who appeared at the fence the next morning while Laura unloaded supplies from her car. Mary was one of those small, wiry women who seemed carved from the same earth she lived on. Her hands were stained with soil, her voice dry with disuse. She told Laura she had lived on the same street for more than 40 years, long enough to see people come and go. About the previous owner, Richard West, she spoke with a mixture of respect and discomfort. "Quiet man," she said, leaning on the fence. "Kept to himself. Worked from home, I think. Some kind of engineer. Hardly anyone saw him in the last years. Then one day, the ambulance came, and he never came back out." She didn't elaborate. Laura thanked her and went back to work. The first few days were consumed by routine, removing the rotted boards from the porch, scrubbing the kitchen tiles, and replacing broken panes. The rhythm was tiring but productive, and by the end of the week, she began to feel a cautious satisfaction. Yet something about the house unsettled her, not in a dramatic, ghostly way, but as a low unease she couldn't quite name. The house felt too quiet. Even with the radio playing in the background, the silence beneath the sound pressed against her ears. On Friday evening, while moving a stack of old rugs, she noticed a peculiar sound beneath her feet. When she stepped on one spot near the end of the hallway, the floor produced not the dull thud of wood over concrete, but a hollow echo, as though an empty space lay beneath. She tested it again. The same sound. She knelt, ran her hand along the seam of the boards, and felt the faintest vibration. Probably a gap in the foundation, she told herself. Nothing unusual in a house this old. But the sound stayed with her, like a note slightly out of tune. That night, she lay awake longer than she meant to, listening. The house expanded and contracted with the cooling air, producing its usual creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked. Then, faintly, from the same section of the hallway, she heard a tiny click, followed by silence. She tried to ignore it. The next morning, she wrote a reminder in her notebook. Check the floor near the stairs. It was her habit to note every imperfection, no matter how small, before starting renovation. Saturday brought more work paint samples, supply runs, phone calls with contractors who either wanted too much money or were booked for weeks. Laura was used to doing much of the labor herself. She stripped the wallpaper, patched the cracks, cleaned out the cabinets, and swept layer after layer of dust. In the process, she began to feel the personality of the house, that stubborn character every old building carried. It was functional, but not welcoming, as if it resented being disturbed. By late afternoon, the light had changed, flattening into that golden haze that made even neglected things look briefly beautiful. She stood by the doorway and looked down the hallway again. The wooden planks glowed faintly in the sunlight, their edges uneven from years of settling. For a moment, she wondered what kind of man had lived here for decades, working alone in silence. She imagined him sitting by the fireplace, drafting diagrams no one would ever see. The thought gave her a brief, inexplicable chill. That evening, she called her sister to talk about the project. They had grown distant over the years, but her sister listened politely as Laura described the house, the plans, the expected profit. "It sounds lonely," her sister said. Laura laughed. "It's just work," she replied. Yet when she hung up, the word lingered. The silence of the house deepened with the fall of night. Before bed, she walked through the rooms, making her usual check of windows and locks. When she stepped on the same patch of hallway, she felt it again. The slight spring beneath the wood, the faintest suggestion of space below. This time she crouched down, pressing her ear to the surface. The wood was cold against her skin. Nothing moved, but the air felt oddly cool, as if drawn from a cellar. She stood up quickly, shaking off the unease. It was just poor insulation. She would deal with it when she redid the floors. The next morning she drove into town for coffee and supplies. Sanders Hill was small, with one main street lined with old storefronts, hardware, grocery, post office, and a diner that smelled of bacon and burnt toast. The waitress recognized her as the new owner of the West Place and asked if she was fixing it up to live in or sell. "Sell," Laura said. The waitress nodded knowingly, as though that answer made perfect sense. People in small towns rarely left, but seemed to accept that others would. Back at the house, Laura spent the afternoon clearing the overgrown yard. The soil was dry, filled with small stones and bottle caps. She unearthed a few rusted tools and a half-buried license plate from the 70s. Nothing unusual, but the physical work helped steady her mind. The sense of ownership, however temporary, began to settle in. She imagined the porch painted, the roof repaired, the photos she'd post online when the time came to sell. When dusk fell, she went inside, washed her hands, and poured a glass of wine. The house was quiet again, except for the faint hum of crickets outside. She walked the hallway once more, almost against her own will, stopping at the same spot. This time she pressed down firmly with her heel. The board dipped slightly, then creaked back. It wasn't her imagination. There was a void beneath. She fetched a small screwdriver from her toolbox and tried prying at the edge, but the board resisted. Whoever had built this section had sealed it deliberately. She sat back on her heels, staring at the wood. There was no reason to be nervous, yet her pulse quickened. Beneath that floor, perhaps a crawl space, or old plumbing. Nothing more. Still, she closed the toolbox, replaced the board she had loosened, and told herself she would call a contractor to inspect it later. That night, the wind rose. The trees outside scraped against the siding, and the windows rattled slightly. Laura woke once to the sound of something shifting in the hallway, a small, muted thud, followed by stillness. She turned on the lamp, heart hammering, but heard nothing further. When morning came, she examined the hallway again. Nothing had changed. The boards looked undisturbed, though the air felt faintly colder in that stretch of floor, as if a draft seeped up from below. By Sunday afternoon, she had almost convinced herself she had imagined it. She made notes for the week ahead, electrical updates, repainting, possible staging options, and closed her notebook with a firm clap. The hollow board would be handled later, once the rest was finished. But as she sat by the window that evening, watching the last light fade across the yard, a single realization began to form. Every house she had worked on before had its quirks, squeaks, drafts, uneven beams, but none had made her feel watched. Here, sometimes, it felt as though the house itself was listening. Perhaps it was only her nerves, the fatigue of starting over, or the weight of isolation. Yet when she rose to turn off the light, her eyes drifted once more to the dark stretch of hallway, and she thought she saw the faintest shimmer where the floor dipped slightly, as though the wood itself was breathing. She stood there a long time, the house silent around her, and finally whispered to the empty air, "It's just old wood, Laura. Just old wood." But the unease stayed. The floor beneath her feet seemed colder than before, and when she went to bed that night, she dreamed of steps leading down into darkness, each one hollow, each one waiting. The days that followed blurred into a steady rhythm of labor, dust, and the muted sounds of repair. Laura had begun to find a kind of comfort in the repetition scraping paint, sanding walls, counting the hours by the changing angles of light through the kitchen window. Yet beneath that order lay a growing restlessness she couldn't explain. Every time she walked down the hallway, her attention drifted to the same patch of floor where the sound had once seemed hollow. She told herself it was only habit, a builder's instinct to note imperfection, but the thought of what might be underneath returned with quiet persistence. On the 5th morning, when the carpenters she'd hired failed to arrive again, she decided to start redoing the flooring herself. It wasn't the first time she'd been left to finish a job alone. Experience had taught her not to depend on anyone. She gathered her tools, rolled up her sleeves, and began pulling the nails from the corner boards. The rhythmic motion steadied her nerves at first, but as she worked her way down the corridor, the air felt heavier. When she reached the spot that had been troubling her, the difference in tone was undeniable. Her hammer hit the wood, and the sound echoed into the dull thud of a solid foundation, but a hollow resonance that seemed to draw the air down with it. She knelt, examining the seam between the planks. One of them had been fitted with unusual precision, its grain pattern slightly misaligned with the rest. When she ran her fingers along the edge, she felt the faint dip of a recessed handle hidden beneath a layer of old varnish. The discovery froze her in place. There it was, a thin metal loop, perfectly flush with the wood, as though meant to disappear. Laura sat back on her heels, wiping her dusty hands on her jeans. For a long minute, she simply stared at it, her mind spinning through rational explanations. Some houses had access panels for wiring or plumbing. Perhaps this was nothing more. Yet she had studied the building plans in the town records, and nowhere had there been mention of a subfloor chamber. Curiosity crept up her spine. She pried the handle up carefully with the edge of her screwdriver. The metal was stiff, but yielded with a dry squeal, and when she lifted, the board rose easily, lighter than expected. Beneath it yawned a dark opening about 3 feet wide. The smell that came out was faint and dry wood, dust, and something metallic. She leaned closer and saw the first outline of a narrow wooden staircase leading down into shadow. Her breath caught. The steps looked solid, the grain of the wood visible even under the thin film of dust. She fetched her flashlight from the kitchen, its weak beam cutting through the gloom. For a moment she hesitated at the top, wondering what sense it made to go down alone. But hesitation had never been her nature. She had learned that hesitation was what made other people stall while she got things done. She crouched, slipped one foot onto the first step, and descended. The air grew cooler with each step. The faint echo of her boots on the wood sounded unnervingly loud in the confined space. When she reached the bottom, the beam of light revealed a low-ceilinged room stretching farther than she'd expected, the walls lined with horizontal planks. It wasn't a crude cellar, nor did it feel like something added haphazardly. Every surface had been fitted with care. She swept the light across the space and saw the outlines of shelves built directly into the walls, a small table, a wooden chair, and an old metal lamp clamped to a workbench. A workroom, she realized, not one meant for storage but for use. Everything was covered in dust, yet nothing seemed random. On one shelf lay a row of glass jars filled with screws and washers. Another held wooden boxes with labels too faded to read. A coil of copper wire hung from a nail. It looked as though someone had simply walked away one day and never returned. Laura stepped closer to the table. The surface was scattered with papers, yellowed notebooks, rolled blueprints tied with string, and a handful of envelopes thick with folded documents. Her flashlight trembled slightly as she set it down to free both hands. She opened one of the notebooks. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, formulas, and measurements drawn in fine pencil strokes. Across several pages ran sketches of machines, some resembling drilling rigs, others unrecognizable contraptions of gears and pistons. She frowned, trying to make sense of the notes. The numbers repeated in consistent patterns. Depths, soil densities, pressure ratios. It looked technical, like engineering work. Yet certain phrases caught her attention. Field test unapproved. Private site 14. Avoid disclosure to county. The handwriting grew sharper, almost frantic in some sections, as though written in haste. She set the notebook aside and opened one of the envelopes. Inside were several typewritten letters, stamped with an official-looking seal. Sanders County Construction and Mineral Office, 1973. The language was clipped and bureaucratic. Requests for permits, safety reports, site assessments, but all bore one consistent notation at the bottom in blue ink. Denied project, suspended pending review. One letter had a handwritten addition across the top margin. Proceed quietly. Results matter more than approval. Her mouth went dry. It wasn't the sort of phrase found in routine paperwork. She opened another envelope and found photographs, black and white, curled at the edges. A group of men stood near a drilling tower, the machinery towering behind them. In the corner of one image, a man with square glasses and a narrow face looked directly at the camera. She recognized him from the obituary she'd seen online when researching the house, Richard West. Turning the photo over, she saw a scrawled note. Sanders Hill Test Keep Safe. Another bore a more cryptic message. If this ever surfaces, bury it. The irony of that choice of words didn't escape her. Laura felt the pulse of unease deepen. She sat on the stool and let the silence of the hidden room settle around her. What kind of project had this been? West had been described as a retired engineer, but this looked like evidence of something larger, a development that had been stopped, hidden, maybe even illegal. She imagined him here in this same chair, drafting plans in the dim light of the lamp, alone beneath the house, aware that the world above had no idea of the work happening below. The beam of her flashlight flickered. She tapped it against her palm, and for a moment the light flared again, catching on something metallic in the far corner. She moved closer. There, beneath a tarp stiff with age, lay a collection of tools: wrenches, gauges, and a small device that looked like a prototype drill head. Beside it sat a wooden crate with more papers inside. She knelt and opened it. The top sheet was dated July 1974 and bore a single line of typed text that made her blood run cold. Test results: withheld. Incident unresolved. Her first instinct was to close the crate and leave everything untouched. She wasn't an investigator or historian. She bought houses, cleaned them up, sold them, and moved on. Whatever this was, it wasn't her problem. Yet as she looked around the room, the orderliness of it contradicted the idea of accident. West had built this space to last. It wasn't the refuge of a hobbyist. It was the archive of a man guarding something. She gathered a few of the letters and photographs, placed them carefully in a folder, and climbed back up the stairs. When she pushed the trapdoor closed behind her, it settled with such precision that the seam vanished. Standing there in the hallway again, she felt as though she had surfaced from another world. For the rest of the day, she worked distractedly. Every hammer strike echoed with the memory of that hidden chamber. The air in the house seemed heavier, as though the discovery had altered it. At sunset, she sat on the porch, folder in her lap, watching the sky darken over the trees. The papers rustled faintly in the evening breeze. She told herself she would put them away and forget about them until the weekend. But when she finally went inside, she couldn't resist one last look. She spread the documents across the kitchen table. The letters formed a pattern. Requests, denials, private memos. In one typed note addressed to H. Bennett, she saw a sentence that made her heart tighten. Keep the records off-site. If questioned, say they were destroyed. The name meant nothing to her then, but she underlined it in pencil. As the hours slipped by, she read through every page, piecing together fragments of a story she didn't fully understand. By the time she set the papers aside, the house was dark except for the faint glow from her lamp. She stood up to turn it off, but before she did, her eyes caught on the seam of the floor again. Now she knew what lay beneath the narrow staircase: the stale air, the quiet evidence of a man's secret life. The discovery hadn't brought clarity. It had opened a door to uncertainty. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the fatigue of both body and mind. This had been just another project when she'd arrived, a structure to renovate, flip, and forget. But the house was no longer only a property. It had a story buried within it, and she had disturbed it. When she finally went to bed, the wind outside had died, leaving a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. In that silence, she imagined she could hear the faint creak of the trapdoor shifting slightly in its frame. She knew it was only the cooling of wood, the harmless expansion of old boards. Yet when she drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams carried her back down those narrow steps, into the dim light of the lamp and the waiting quiet of the room below, where the air still smelled faintly of metal and secrecy, and the past was not yet finished with her. The next few mornings passed in a haze of restlessness. Laura went about her routine as if by instinct, measuring planks, cleaning corners, keeping the drill steady. But her mind refused to stay in the present. Every sound in the house seemed amplified now. The creak of the hallway floor made her turn her head. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a whisper. She couldn't stop thinking about the room beneath her feet. The more she tried to treat it as just another strange feature of an old property, the more she realized how deliberate it had been. Whoever built that hidden space had known exactly what they were doing. By Tuesday, she told herself to put the discovery aside. It was too easy to get lost in speculation, and she had deadlines to meet. But something inside her insisted there was more. When she looked at the neatly folded letters and blueprints she had taken from the trapdoor room, a quiet urgency stirred in her chest. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was responsibility. The engineer, Richard West, had left behind something meant to be found eventually, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that his silence had cost him more than his peace. The following morning, while she was weeding the patch of grass near the porch, a car pulled into the drive. A pale gray sedan, clean but aged, the kind that looked like it belonged to someone who never drove too fast. The man who stepped out was tall, dressed in pressed slacks and a collared shirt. His face was angular, his eyes shadowed by a pair of dark glasses. He approached with the kind of calm politeness that hides an undercurrent of unease. "Mrs. Mitchell?" he asked, his tone formal. She nodded cautiously. "My name's Harold Bennett. I used to work with Mr. West." The name caught her off guard. She remembered it instantly from one of the letters she'd read. She forced a neutral expression and wiped her hands on her jeans. That was a long time ago, wasn't it? "Yes," Bennett said softly, looking past her toward the house. "I heard about his passing. I was sorry to learn of it. He was a brilliant man. Dedicated. Obsessive, maybe, but brilliant." His gaze lingered on the front steps, as if picturing something that wasn't there anymore. "You bought the property recently?" "That's right," Laura replied. "I'm renovating it for resale." He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. A fine house, sturdy bones. He built much of it himself, you know. Always preferred to handle the details personally. She nodded, but didn't invite him in. The air between them thickened. After a pause, Bennett took a step closer. "If you don't mind my asking," he said carefully, "while you were cleaning up, did you happen to come across any of his old things? Tools, notes, perhaps?" His tone was too measured, too precise, as if the words had been rehearsed. Laura's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face still. "Just some papers," she said casually. "Old receipts, nothing interesting." "Receipts," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "I see." He nodded once, then produced a small card from his pocket and held it out to her. "If you do find anything else, please let me know. Some of Richard's research was sensitive. It would be best if certain documents didn't get misplaced." Laura took the card. There was a phone number, but no company name, only his initials printed in black ink. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Bennett gave a faint smile that didn't quite feel friendly, then turned back toward his car. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I appreciate your time." When the car disappeared down the road, Laura stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the card in her hand. Her pulse thudded in her ears. He hadn't come looking for old memories. He had come looking for what was hidden. She went back inside and immediately checked the folder on the kitchen table. Everything was still there. But her relief didn't last long. The way he had looked at the house before leaving it was the look of someone who already knew where to search. That night, she double-locked the doors and shoved a heavy chair over the trapdoor before going to bed. The house was silent except for the hum of crickets. Around midnight, she woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Her heart pounded. She sat up, straining to listen. The noise stopped, followed by the soft creak of wood. The floor near the hallway groaned. 2 steps, and then nothing. She held her breath until her lungs ached. When she finally gathered the courage to move, she took the flashlight from her bedside drawer and crept into the hall. The beam cut across the empty walls. The trapdoor was closed. Everything looked as she had left it. But the faintest draft brushed her bare feet, a cool current seeping upward from below. She turned the flashlight off and forced herself to breathe slowly. No intruder, she told herself. Just the house settling again. In the morning, she found the back door unlocked. She was certain she had turned the bolt before bed. On the counter, her coffee mug had been moved 2 inches to the right. The tiny change was enough to make her stomach turn. She decided to drive into town. The main street, with its old brick buildings and dusty windows, felt almost reassuring in its ordinariness. She stopped at the small public library and asked the clerk about company records from the 1970s. The clerk led her to a corner where old newspapers were stored on microfilm. Hours passed as Laura scrolled through faded headlines until one caught her attention. Collapse at Hillstone Mine 3 missing. The article was dated August 1974. The details were vague, the tone dismissive. A routine accident. No investigation results were printed. Near the bottom of the piece, she saw a list of names. One of them was Harold Bennett. Her breath tightened. There it was again. The same man who had stood in her driveway pretending to be polite. According to the report, he had been a junior technician at the site, but left the company soon after the collapse. No follow-up stories mentioned him again. She printed the article and folded it into her notebook. When she returned home, the afternoon light had turned sharp and thin. The house greeted her with silence. She set her bag down and checked the hallway immediately. The chair was still in place over the trapdoor, but something on the floor caught her attention. A faint mark near the baseboard, a smear of dirt shaped like the edge of a boot. She knelt and touched it. The soil was fresh. Someone had been inside. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She backed away, scanning the room. Nothing else seemed disturbed, yet the certainty grew that she was being watched. She walked through every room, opening closets, pulling back curtains. The house was empty. But in the bathroom, the mirror above the sink was streaked with moisture, as though someone had recently run hot water. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the folder of documents. The papers, the photographs, the notes, all of it pointed to something West had hidden deliberately. Now it was clear why. Someone wanted them gone. At dawn, she made another decision. If she didn't understand what she was dealing with, she would find someone who could. She spent the next morning on the phone with the county offices, pretending to be researching the property's history for an insurance appraisal. The clerk transferred her to archives. The voice on the other end sounded tired but helpful. After some digging, he confirmed that Hillstone Minerals had operated in the area for 10 years, mostly under private contracts. The company dissolved after a safety incident. No public record of an official investigation existed. When she asked if any personal files for Richard West remained, the clerk hesitated, then said quietly, "If there were, they were sealed. Some of those projects were military-funded. People stopped asking questions a long time ago." She hung up slowly, her fingers trembling. Military funding. Sealed records. Suddenly, the quiet man who had built a hidden room beneath his house no longer seemed eccentric, but terrified. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she noticed a figure standing by the mailbox at the end of the drive. Her heart leapt. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, hands in his pockets. She opened the door halfway and called out, but the sound of her voice seemed to startle him. He turned, and for a moment, she caught a glimpse of his profile. It was Bennett. Without a word, he walked to his car and drove off. She locked the door again and pressed her back against it, trying to calm her breathing. Her thoughts raced through possibilities. Should she call the police? What would she tell them? That a man had looked at her mailbox. They'd think she was paranoid, and maybe she was, but the fear that had been a whisper before now felt like a presence that followed her from room to room. The next day brought rain, steady and cold. Laura spent the morning pacing the kitchen, unable to focus on work. At noon, she heard a distant knock, a single, hollow sound that echoed through the house. When she opened the door, no one was there. Only the rain, washing over the porch. A small, folded note lay on the step. It was a page torn from an old notebook, the handwriting cramped and slanted. "Leave it where it belongs," it read. No signature. Her hands shook as she closed the door. The message could only have come from Bennett. Somehow he knew she had the documents. He had either been inside again or watching close enough to understand she'd found them. That night, she placed the folder in her car trunk, locking it there. She couldn't bear to keep it in the house anymore. But the house didn't release its hold on her. She dreamed of the room below, the papers laid out like maps, the smell of oil and earth. In one dream, she saw West himself, thin, gray, sitting at the desk with his pen moving quickly across a page. When he looked up, his face was neither kind nor fearful, only tired. "Tell them," he said. "Someone has to tell them." She woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, and the image stayed with her long after dawn. By the time the sky cleared, her decision was made. She couldn't keep silent. She returned to the local archives and copied every remaining reference to Hillstone Minerals, every notice of property transfer, every obituary of the miners who had vanished. The deeper she looked, the more patterns emerged. Payments made to officials, construction permits that had been filed and then retracted, entire sections of land quietly bought and resold. When she drove back to the house that evening, she noticed the front door was ajar. The chair over the trap door had been moved. She stood frozen on the threshold, staring at the empty space. The air inside felt different, disturbed. Slowly she stepped forward, scanning the floor. The trapdoor itself was open. She hesitated at the edge, listening. The silence below was absolute. She shone her flashlight down, but the beam caught only dust. The papers, the notebooks, the crate. They were gone. Everything. Laura's knees went weak. She sank to the floor, the realization flooding through her. Bennett had taken them. He must have waited until she left for the day, entered quietly, and removed everything. Yet he hadn't destroyed the evidence. Not yet. The fact that the note had warned her to leave it where it belongs meant he wanted the past to stay buried, not erased. But she couldn't allow that. Not anymore. She would find a way to make it known, even if it cost her the safety she had left. She closed the trap door, pressing the board back into place until the seam vanished again. The house was silent, but no longer with the emptiness of neglect. It was the silence of something ending and something else beginning. The story beneath her feet had risen into her life now, and she understood that whatever Richard West had died trying to hide, she had already become a part of it. Morning came pale and still, the kind of morning when the horizon looks washed clean, and for a few fleeting minutes the world feels like it has paused to decide what happens next. Laura sat in her kitchen, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in her hands. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the open trap door, the bare emptiness of the room below, the scattered dust where the papers had been. It wasn't fear anymore that gripped her. It was purpose. The choice she had been postponing for days had finally cornered her. She could bury everything, pretend she had seen nothing, sell the house and walk away. Or she could finish what Richard West had started and bring the truth into the light, even if it meant drawing danger toward herself. The thought of Bennett lingered like a shadow in her mind. He had taken the documents with an efficiency that spoke of practice, not desperation. He had been prepared, maybe even waiting for someone like her to uncover the secret so he could retrieve it. But his note, "Leave it where it belongs," told her something more. He wasn't trying to destroy the evidence. He was trying to keep it contained, locked in history, where it couldn't harm the people it implicated. That meant others might still be alive. People with names in those files. People with something to lose. She opened her laptop and searched again for references to the Hillstone project. The results were sparse. Fragmented pieces of corporate history mergers, land acquisitions, dissolved companies. She found one article written by a journalist 2 decades ago about the environmental impact of unregulated drilling in Sanders County. The author's name caught her eye. Samuel Caldwell. Her mother had known a reporter by that name years ago, back when she still worked in Denver. Laura remembered him vaguely, a man who asked too many questions and smiled as if he already knew the answers. It took her only a few minutes to find an email address attached to a small regional publication still active under his editorship. She hesitated before typing. She didn't want to sound like one of those conspiracy enthusiasts who filled inboxes with wild claims. She described only the facts: an old house, hidden documents, a sealed investigation, a man claiming to be a former colleague. She attached one of the scanned letters she had photographed before everything disappeared, then signed simply LM and hit send. The sound of the email leaving her outbox felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried a weight far greater than a few kilobytes of text. The response came faster than expected, barely 2 hours later. If you're willing to talk, meet me at Rayner's Cafe tomorrow at noon. Bring nothing else. There was no signature, but she knew it was him. The rest of that day she moved through the house like a ghost, checking locks, testing the windows, making sure no one could enter again. The silence of the place had changed. It no longer felt merely empty but watchful. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Bennett's silhouette in the doorway. When night fell, she lay awake, listening for sounds that didn't come. The storm that gathered after midnight drummed against the roof until dawn. The next day was cold and bright. Laura arrived at the cafe early and took a seat near the back, where she could see both the door and the street beyond. A man entered 10 minutes later, tall, with thinning hair and the unmistakable weariness of someone who had seen too much of the world's hidden corners. He walked straight to her table, sat down without greeting, and placed a small recorder between them. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. She told him everything: the trapdoor, the papers, the photographs, the man named Bennett. He listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. When she finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "I've been following Hillstone for years," he said. "They built test sites across the county back in the 70s, experimenting with chemical extraction. Cheap methods, dangerous ones. When the mine collapsed, it wasn't an accident. They hit something they shouldn't have: groundwater. The contamination spread for miles, but they covered it up. West must have kept the proof. And now it's gone," Laura said quietly. Caldwell nodded. "Maybe not. If Bennett took it, he's part of the old network. Some of those men are still alive and they have connections. But the story's not dead if you're willing to go on record." She looked out the window. The thought of exposing herself made her stomach twist, but the alternative was worse: silence, complicity. "What would happen if I did?" He studied her face. "People will come asking questions you can't answer. You'll lose privacy. Maybe your safety for a while. But the truth has a way of outlasting fear." She met his gaze and saw that he believed it. "Then write it," she said. The next days unfolded like a slow, unspooling thread. Caldwell dug into archives, contacting old sources, cross-referencing property records. He traced payments made through shell companies that led directly to Hillstone's board and, astonishingly, to a local official who was still serving in county government. He called her each evening, his voice steady, but charged with urgency. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the story wasn't merely about a collapsed mine, but about decades of silence bought and maintained through intimidation. On the 4th night, as Laura sat by the window reviewing her notes, Headlights flashed briefly outside the house. She froze, heart racing. But when she looked again, the car had already driven past. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She packed a small overnight bag and left the house before dawn, checking into a motel on the edge of town. The air in the room smelled faintly of bleach and coffee grounds, but it was anonymous, and for now that was enough. A week later, the article went live. It began with a photograph of the mine ruins' jagged metal rising from the earth like broken ribs, and beneath it, the headline, "The Collapse They Buried, Hillstone's Hidden Disaster." The story named names, cited dates, included scanned copies of the letters Laura had preserved, and referenced a private residence containing a sealed archive. Her name did not appear at her request. The impact was immediate. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets. Within days, the county opened an inquiry. Bennett's name surfaced again, tied to several consulting firms linked to the original project. When investigators tried to contact him, he was nowhere to be found. His house in Denver was empty, his phone disconnected. Laura read each new headline with a mixture of relief and dread. She had wanted the truth to come out, and it had. But truth, she realized, never came without consequence. The following week, her phone began ringing late at night. Each time she answered, there was only silence on the other end, before the line clicked dead. Once, when she returned to the house to collect more of her belongings, she found the gate open and muddy footprints on the porch. Nothing had been taken, but someone had been there. She stayed cautious, kept the lights off, and avoided routine. Caldwell advised her to disappear for a while until the noise settled. "The story will take on its own life," he said. "Let it." But even as he said it, she could tell he knew what that meant, that once released, the truth belonged to no one. 2 months later, the county announced criminal charges against 2 surviving executives of Hillstone Minerals. A trust fund was established for the families of the miners who had died in the collapse. The site itself was declared hazardous and sealed off. The town treated the revelation like a long-buried sickness, finally forced to the surface, painful but necessary. Laura returned to the house one last time before selling it. The winter air carried the smell of damp wood and pine needles. She walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, as if memorizing their texture. The kitchen looked ordinary again, stripped of the clutter of investigation. In the hallway, she stopped above the place where the trapdoor lay hidden beneath the new flooring. She could still feel the faint unevenness underfoot, though she had covered it seamlessly. For a long time she stood there, her hand pressed to the wall, listening to the stillness. She spoke aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over now." The words hung in the air without echo. She closed her eyes and pictured the hidden room as it had been, the shelves, the tools, the letters scattered like relics of another man's conscience. She realized then that West had not built that secret space out of fear, but out of trust. Trust that someone, someday, would uncover the truth he couldn't tell himself. When she stepped outside, the morning light was thin but clear. She locked the door for the last time and slipped the key into her coat pocket. On the horizon, the hills rose quiet and unchanged, but she knew something invisible had shifted. Truth, once freed, altered the air around it. A month later, she read in the paper that the house had been purchased by a historical preservation group. They planned to restore it and turn the property into a small museum chronicling the county's industrial past. The irony made her smile faintly. The house that had once hidden the truth would now protect it. On her drive out of town, she stopped by the edge of the old Hillstone site. The air was colder there, the ground uneven and scarred. She stood for a moment at the chain-link fence, looking at the distant machinery frozen in decay. A faint wind stirred the dust, carrying with it the sharp scent of metal. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. That night, in a motel far from Sanders Hill, she wrote a brief note to Caldwell. "Thank you for finishing what someone else began. The truth belongs to everyone now." She didn't sign her name. When she turned off the lamp, the darkness no longer felt heavy. She thought of the trap door, sealed and silent beneath the new floor, and the life she would now begin elsewhere. There would always be other houses, other walls, other echoes. But she knew she would never again look at any of them as simple structures. Every place, she realized, holds a memory of the hands that built it and the choices made inside it. Some keep those memories close, buried deep. Others, given time, find a way to speak. As she drifted into sleep, the wind outside pressed gently against the window, carrying with it the faintest sound, a low, hollow note that might have been the whisper of air beneath old boards. Or maybe, she thought, it was just the world breathing again after too many years of silence. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos for more unbelievable true-to-life stories, and share this one with your friends. You never know who'll be inspired by it.